my previous video, I asked if you know of any more references to classical music that can be found in Fontaine OST. Well, it seems that there's many that I missed. Even the main Fontaine OST borrows some elements from pre-existing classical pieces. The initial motive of is borrowed from Grieg's Piano Concerto, Opus 16. This is a clear reference down not to just the melody, but also to the chord progression. And this is not even the end for Fontaine's theme, as the second motive that this Fontaine theme introduces is also reference to Shostakovich's second waltz. It's another very obvious reference, like the way that the orchestra plays is very similar, and also the flow of the melody is very similar, albeit with small variations. This makes it seem like the Fontaine theme started out as laying out a bunch of references, and then slowly developed them into a longer and original piece. Then moving on to a composer that seems to have played a defining role on how the general Fontainian landscape would sound. To my knowledge, Gabriel Fauré is never referenced in any longer motive, but the Fontaine behind the scenes video mentions him as one of the main inspirations. So I gave a listen to some of his pieces, and indeed he's not referenced in an obvious way in any of the soundtracks, but his subtle influence can be observed in numerous soundtracks. The minor chords that are played at the start of his very beautiful composition Sicilienne seem to have given Hoyo composers the starting idea for the soundtrack Raven Glass of Darkness. However, this soundtrack later develops into a different and distinct piece from Sicilienne. Same goes for this piece, whose title is written on the screen right now because I cannot pronounce that, as its starting chord progression and melody seem to have been inspired, but not directly taken from Fauré's Pavane. Maybe it's a stretch, but I think the influence of Fauré here is evident. And if you're very attentive during the very beginning of Fauré's Pavane, you may have noticed that there was this melody, this quiet melody, played on pizzicato strings. And to me, when I first heard that, my thoughts immediately jumped to yet another soundtrack called Susurrating Holt that starts with an incredibly similar melody on the strings. Like, this slightly mysterious vibe it gives off is exactly the same to Fauré's Pavane. So it seems that Pavane is referenced in two separate soundtracks in Fontaine OST. Then in the previous video I mentioned a soundtrack that has a reference to Bach's cello suite, but I missed another soundtrack that is influenced by Bach. It is the soundtrack that appears in the form of a fugue that plays in Harmonia. The fugue is a musical form that was mostly pioneered by Bach, therefore it makes this soundtrack from Harmonia very reminiscent of some of Bach's fugues from the well-tempered clavier. Then Quo Vadis, a strikingly beautiful piano piece, has a chord progression and a dreamy style that seems to have been inspired by Chopin's Nocturne No. 20. The melody, however, is quite different, which brings some originality and freshness to Genshin's piece. The metal soundtracks are interesting too. Praetorian Golem soundtrack from Remuria adapts a style that is incredibly similar to Vivaldi's violin concertos. Well, again, there is no direct reference where the melody could be like copy and pasted, but the style is very similar to Vivaldi's, with those larger melodic jumps, memorable and clear phrases, and tremolos that add tension, which is a very clear reference to Vivaldi's violin concertos. The best example that I can think of, and you're probably gonna notice a similarity, is the first movement of Winter from the Four Seasons. As for textual references, of which there are many that I'm not going to really go over, as I want to focus on the references that you can hear in music itself, and not just by looking at the title, but there is still one textual reference that was brought up by a commenter in my previous video that I found quite intriguing. Furina's first constellation is called "Love is a rebellious bird that none can tame," which in French translates to the lyrics of a very famous opera, Carmen, by Bizet, which you have probably heard of. And I saved the best for last. It's not just Fontaine as a region that loves referencing classical music, but also Fontainian characters. Sandroni's theme that plays in the cutscene with the Torre takes so many references from Mozart's Piano Concerto in D minor that Mozart is even credited as one of the composers for the soundtrack. If you listen to this short excerpt from Mozart's concerto, you might notice that the melody is the same as the one that plays during the infamous moment when Sandroni says "not really," which I find hilarious and amazing at the same time. Honestly, researching all those references that can be found in Fontaine has changed my perspective on Fontaine OST, because while referencing classical music is perfectly allowed, and often used to showcase the composer's musical integrity, as in, wow, why composers must be so smart to be aware of all those historically significant pieces and include them in their own music, there is a point where it gets excessive in my opinion, and referencing overshadows the composer's ability of expressing themselves authentically and being innovative. So it's a double-edged sword, and while I appreciate all the references from Fontaine OST, I do also appreciate authentic expression, and Fontaine is keeping those two in a very delicate balance. Anyway, if there are even more references that you know of, please send them in the comments, and while I'm probably not gonna make a part 3 of the video, I can still do a pinned comment or something. Also tune in tomorrow when I'm going to do a Luna 7 special program watch party. I hope you have an amazing rest of the day.